There's a story in the scriptures that you may have forgotten about, but it's part of the story of David and Saul. And you'll remember Saul becomes mad and jealous of David after his fall from obedience to God and his lack of faith in God. And he's chasing after David, and David makes good his escape, but he carries nothing with him, so he goes to a priest who supplies him with bread, sacred bread as it happens, and the sword of Goliath. And then David goes off and begins a kind of resistance against Saul. And Saul goes to the priest who didn't know what David was doing, didn't know he was running away from Saul, and he suspects them of treason. And so he questions them, and the priest, Abiathar, says, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course I helped David. Of course I helped him. He's the most favored in your court. He's your great champion. He does your business. And Saul says, I don't believe you, and he orders the murder of all of the priests. Of 82 priests, he orders their death. And then there's a wonderful act of resistance. His own men, the commanders of hundreds and thousands of his own tribe, the Benjamites, refuse to carry out his orders. They refuse to touch the priests. And so Saul then turns to a man named Doeg the Edomite, who was the informant, who was the one who had told Saul that the priests had helped David. And he says, all right, Doeg, you kill them all. And Doeg kills all the priests, and then he kills the entire Levitical town. He kills all the men, all the women, all the children, all the animals in the Levitical town. And a transformation, the second argument that the Magdeburgian pastors make, is they say, look, in conscience, if you were there and Saul ordered you to kill God's people, if he ordered you to kill people who were ministering in God's temple like we claim to be, would you do it? Would you follow along? Would you take up the sword? If you were one of Saul's rulers, his lesser magistrates, would you obey him? Who would you be? Would you be Doeg the Edomite, who in Psalm 52 is excoriated and cursed and said to be someone who has chosen his own strength over God, who is condemned and damned? Would you be like Doeg, or would you be like the officers who refused? And then they complete their argument by saying, look, all we're asking you to do is to fulfill God's command that he's given you, not to murder people. All we're asking you to do, you other princes of Germany, you other lesser magistrates, all we're asking you to do is what your conscience tells you would have to do if you had to choose between murdering people or refusing instructions like the lesser officials of Saul did. That's all we're asking you to do. This is it. If it got too complicated in our first argument, here's the way we'll put it to you now. You're always, if you're a lesser magistrate, in a Doeg versus Benjamite situation. Will you be like the Benjamites who refuse to commit murder, who obey God, not man, or will you be like Doeg, who obeys man and despises God? That's it. That's it. It works on a slightly different level. It's a more, if we talk about in your 1L class on rhetoric, if we talk about the difference between an argument that appeals to logos and an argument that appeals to pathos, it's somewhere in the middle. It's an appeal to conscience, the immediate testimony that we feel of conscience. Of course I wouldn't want to be the guy who picked up the sword and murdered those people. That's the structure of it. And that's where I'd like to get in, just to remind us of what we're doing. I get overwhelmed when I think about Magdeburg and this little tiny city as a heroic example for us that stood up to the most massive empire imaginable. One little city surrounded by a vast army. I can get very carried away thinking about what a heroic past our forefathers in the Reformation left for us. But it's good to remember, ultimately what we're doing here is not simply trying to learn interesting history, which is challenging for us. It's not even trying to learn the arguments about how the Magdeburgians put forward this argument in a way that was adopted later in the centuries of resistance to those who would overthrow Christian faith in Europe. I mean, these arguments that the Magdeburgians made that we're reading now, as we'll see as we travel through the centuries after this, become kind of classic. They're referred to explicitly, they're used again and again. But we're not looking in this study for reasons to disobey, either reasons because of historical exemplars of wild, heroic figures who disobeyed, nor are we looking just to master arguments in a kind of rhetorical fashion that would enable us to argue equally well for resistance and against resistance. Ultimately, what we want is to find a way to relate to the law, whether in obedience or in disobedience, that whatever we're doing is a way of following God, a way of trusting in God, a way of relating to God. We're Christians because we have found in Christ the great glory, the great joy, the great wonder of following after our Lord in whatever we do. And if we find a part of our human experience where we can't do that, whether it's our marriages, our friendships, our politics, our legal work, our studies, if we find a part of our life where we can't enjoy Christ, that tears us up. Once you've tasted the joy of following after Christ, that's what you want to do. And part of the reason for the Reformation is to say, you can follow Jesus Christ as much as a lawyer, as a farmer, as a mechanic, in whatever profession God has called you to be. You can enjoy following Christ as much as somebody who spends all day in a cell, a monastic cell, praying, fasting, and reading the scriptures full time. The mother in her home, the businessman doing business, the lawyer over his papers, we all are focused, if we live aright, in the same way, trusting in God, seeking the source and core of our experience and activity in faithfulness to Him. If we are going to be lawyers, if we're going to spend the great time of our lives being lawyers, then it behooves us to know something about what it means to approach the law for the Lord's sake. We know we can do this, 1 Peter 2:13. Our basic, if the law fundamentally binds, the fundamental idea of the law, this is the old etymology, law comes from the word ligare, which means to bind. If law is fundamentally about what binds and what compels obedience, well, then we better find out a way to obey, to understand its authority for the Lord's sake. That's what Peter tells us. Don't just submit yourself to the law because of fear. Don't submit yourself to the law, don't use the law, don't follow the law because it's useful to you or because you fear it, whether it's because of a reward or a penalty. You either follow the law for the Lord's sake or you miss the great joy of being a follower of Jesus Christ in your life. So the reason, fundamentally, aside from the incredibly heroic example of Magdeburg, aside from the way in which these arguments became classics and were repeated again and again and again, as we'll see throughout history, and it's very difficult in some ways to understand the ideological structures of subsequent historical resistance to governments without understanding some of these arguments. But fundamentally, what's interesting about these arguments is here are people who are surrounded by the enemy. There's artillery, there's guns going off, and what they want to do is to figure out how they can resist, do what they're doing in a way where their faithfulness to God is emphasized, how they can resist in a way that shares with the people of the town and surrounding areas why they would do this because they trusted in God, how they would do this as an act of faith in God rather than an act of self-assertion or even of ethics. Ethics are wonderful, but Christians don't believe that we become God's children through ethics. We don't believe that we're superior to the Pharisees because we have better ethics. We're not. We become more ethical because we have Jesus Christ. We become more ethical because we're transformed by the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. We become more ethical because of our hope in eternal life. And you can imagine a different way that the Magdeburgians could have written this, where they wouldn't have written this about faith. They just would have written a straight political treatise about their right to rebel. The Magdeburgians might have saved time by just making legal, political, philosophical, theological arguments about why they had the right to rebel. But they didn't. They tried to put what they were doing in the context of trusting in God. And you can imagine a comparison between two people. Imagine a person who's interested in studying marriage because he wants to know the ethics of marriage. It's a very noble thing to want to know. It's very good. What should you and shouldn't you do in marriage? How should you get married? What are the things you should and shouldn't do in marriage? All very noble things to pursue, wonderful things to pursue. But a prior question for Christians is, what is marriage? Most particularly, is it something given to us by God? Is it something that I approach because of my trust in God? Is it God's creation? Is it part of God's order? When I enter into marriage, when I hold myself united to my husband or my wife, do I do it not because I understand everything, but because, as Paul says, here's a mystery. Here is a direct manifestation of God. Here you are in direct contact with what God's doing. That's actually how Paul explains it. And we can have the same kind of division in law. Just as it's very good to want to know the ethics of marriage, but there's something more to know about marriage. It's very good to want to know about right and wrong with respect to resistance or with respect especially to torts. That's a very good thing to want to know right and wrong about. But there's something much more that we want to know about law. There's something much more that the Magdeburgians teach us, which is in the hot, white heat of war, with an enemy army surrounding them and pounding away at them with the fear of death before them, they are just as interested in showing how their approach to law is grounded in their faith in God. That they believe that law, they believe that politics is not some mere creation of man, as later thinkers would put it in the Enlightenment, that law and politics are just cleverness of man, but that it's part of an order that God has established, just like marriage. It's something that God has put together. It's something that we have to approach and trust in as a way of trusting and approaching in God. So the structure of the two arguments that we find in the readings that we've had, the arguments that they offer, are not just arguments about the right of resistance. They say you have a right under certain circumstances of resisting. Faith in God, following after God faithfully, doesn't lead us to do the wrong thing. It leads us to do the right thing. But they present these arguments within the order of faith, within the order of somebody who wants to submit to law, not because of what it does that's good for you or to avoid a danger for you, but who wants to relate to law as a way of relating to God. So the first argument that we looked at last week they say, look at Romans 13. Romans 13 describes the ruler as one who is doing a particular sort of thing for God. He's a minister of God's righteousness. He's punishing wickedness, and he's supporting the honorable and the virtuous. And if you find somebody who claims to be a ruler who's not doing those things, well, then he's not part of God's ordinance. He's not part of God's providential plan. And at this point, the argument might sound a little, as we called it before, Ciceronian. That is to say, it might sound to belong to the revolutionary spirit that says as soon as you find the government doing something unjust, you have a right to rebel. But they deny that. They say, no, our response to injustice comes within the context of our trusting that God is the one who's established this order. And God has not just established single figures within the law. There's not just one man. There's a great host of men. There's higher magistrates. There's equal magistrates. There's lower magistrates. The question for you when you find yourself confronted by a tyrant, somebody who claims to be a Romans 13 ruler but isn't, the question is, who is resisting him in his place and station? Who has the calling to resist him? The ordinary person, they say, will be a superior magistrate, an equal magistrate, someone of the same rank, or an inferior magistrate. Somebody who has already received a call to exercise human authority, a call to use the sword, somebody who has already been clearly charged by God with the responsibility of using the sword to defeat evil, to punish evildoers. That is the natural person to look for in faith if you believe that God has set up this order. So they say, don't jump as the tyrannicides do to murder evil rulers. Trust in faith that God will provide you with a lesser magistrate in his time to answer the injustice that you're facing. The modification that they make, the difference that faith makes for them, is they say, how can we who have received so many blessings doubt that this is really part of God's political legal order? How can we doubt that God will provide us with one of his constituted authorities to cast these evildoers down? Why do they believe that? Because they believe that God has established an order of justice in the world, that God will have chosen his people, appointed his people to do this. The second argument they make in today's reading is illustrated for them by the Doeg situation that I talked about at the beginning. They say, very interestingly, they say, the doctrine of resistance is just an exposition of, they number it a little bit differently, of the fifth commandment, that is to say, the commandment to prevent murder. They say all that we're doing in announcing a doctrine of resistance to rulers is reminding you, as if we were talking to those officials of Benjamin, you have an obligation, of course, not to murder, but you also have an obligation to stop Doeg from murdering all the priests. All that we're doing is looking at that situation and saying, come on, guys, it was good that you refused Saul's command to commit murder of all the priests. That was good. But surely you had an obligation to stop one man from murdering all of the priests of the Lord at Nob. All that we're saying about resistance is that you have a duty to obey God. Here's a very basic command that God has given. Don't murder. And they interpreted the Ten Commandments. They said not only are the Ten Commandments, if it says don't murder, they looked at the rest of the Ten Commandments where it interpreted that to create positive duties to prevent killings and murder. And they said, in addition, and Jesus does this as well, when God says don't murder, he also means prevent, stop unnecessary, wrongful wrongful killing. So the second argument makes the following move. It says, what appears to the world as disobedience to man, properly understood in terms of God, is just obedience to God's command. God has commanded you to protect people from murder. God has commanded and specially charged the inferior magistrates, don't let people go around murdering people. All we're saying is don't stand by like the Benjamites did in the day of Nob and allow Doeg the Edomite to murder all the priests. Stand up to him. Stop him. We're not asking you to disobey man so much as we are asking you clearly to obey the command of God. And they say, in conscience, really, your problem isn't knowing what's right to do in this situation. It's not some theoretical problem about when do you obey or when do you disobey. It wasn't a theoretical problem. It wasn't a problem of the mind that kept the Benjamites from stopping Doeg the Edomite from murdering all the priests. What was the problem? Faithfulness. The problem was they were not confident that their assertion as lesser magistrates would be vindicated by God. They became fearful of Saul. They became lax in their duty. They were not willing to follow the command of God in all situations. So this is a pretty bold way of putting resistance theory. But this is the way that they argue it. Don't get too hung up on the details, folks. Don't get too excited. Don't get too confused. This doctrine of resistance is just, they're following the old counting of the Ten Commandments when they call it the fifth. Therefore, it's just an exposition of the commandment not to kill, which makes guilty of murder not only those who take away life unjustly, but also those who do not rescue. And in a few minutes, we'll get into why there are arguments about why that's true. We have an obligation through the law. We can trust God's command more than the commands of men. If we follow them, we will be like David says he was, a green planted olive tree, secure in the Lord. If we follow after the Benjamites, we'll die like Doeg did. So do the experiment of conscience that they ask of you. Try the experiment out. Imagine yourself as Saul's officials before this obvious injustice. Saul is recklessly, bizarrely ordering the massacre of all the priests of the Lord. If he commanded you to do that and you did it, of course you would feel shame, right? That's what Doeg does. He follows the command of Saul and kills them all. But what if Saul commanded you to do that and you refused to do it, but then you watched as one man went around and slaughtered 82 priests and then went to the village and killed all their wives and their children and their fathers and their mothers and all their livestock? Would you feel a similar kind of shame? Maybe not exactly the same as if you'd done it yourself. Would you feel a similar kind of shame that you had watched this be done? Now, they say, of course, you're a lesser magistrate. These are there's the king, and the king appoints rulers of thousands and hundreds. That's who these Benjamites are. They're not the king. They don't have authority over Doeg. Would that make you feel unashamed if you had watched him do those things? And they say all we're arguing when we say that lesser magistrates should rise up and resist is contained in your feelings about this situation. And it's not just contained in your feelings about this situation, it's contained in the clear teaching of the law of God. This isn't an exposition of your feelings. Your feelings correspond particularly if you're a Christian who's been raised in the admonition of the Lord, your feeling in this matter corresponds to the teaching of the law. And so they talk about what the law teaches. Obviously, the Ten Commandments say that you shouldn't murder. But the law, in interpreting that, the Reformed teachers and the church have always said, following after Jesus, that the command not to murder is not just a negative command. That the commands of the Decalogue imply positive duties as well. It's the fullness of the covenant. And when Moses explains the covenant, he shows us that these duties have positive obligations as well. So we see these in the law. Not only should you not murder, but you shouldn't do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. Well, now we have a positive command. We're moving in the direction of taking positive steps to eliminate those activities that endanger your life. A good example of these is the obligation to pen up a bull. If a boar gores a man or woman to death, and the bull has been in the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. So here we move from merely negative injunctions, don't intentionally try to kill someone, to a positive injunction. Where you're aware that something in your possession poses a danger to other people, the bull, you have a positive obligation to neutralize that danger to someone else. And if you don't neutralize that danger, well, then you're guilty of killing. The consequence for you is to be stoned to death. Well, this is the punishment that comes if you commit intentional murder. There's a positive injunction that follows with the command. The Ten Commandments sum up all the elements of the covenant, we're told, and this is one of the elements of the covenant, and so they say, we know that the obligation to prevent murders is a positive obligation. By the way, in the history of the Jewish people and the history of the church, this passage has been interpreted quite broadly. Certainly it applies to dangerous bulls. It obviously applies to ordinary situations of life that we deal with in the law of negligence and strict liability today, where the law imposes certain kinds of consequences for physical loss on people. Probably, no, almost certainly one of the most interesting areas of law, except for property, Dean Lee. But Paul says, and this is very much in keeping with the history of historic Jewish interpretation and the church's interpretation, says when the law makes rules about bulls, when the law makes rules about slaves or foreigners in the law, is it only about them that the law is concerned? Or rather, is the law giving us an example that encourages us to think, if I have to do this for the least, what should I do in situations where the obligation is even stronger? So Paul uses this in the example of, should you provide me with provisions? Should you give me provision when I'm teaching the gospel? Of course you should, because there's even provision provided for an ox who's treading out the grain. If an ox should be allowed to eat from the grain that he's treading out, how much more should a minister of the gospel be allowed to be sustained through the ministry on which he's laboring? That's Paul's argument. He says, is it just, when God lays down this rule in the law, is it just animals that God is concerned about? No, he says. Well, this is the similar way in which Exodus 21:28 has been read. God is, of course, concerned. When you face a dangerous bull, you should take precautions. When you face a dangerous bull, you should treat that as an important situation and take precautions about it. But is God just concerned about bulls? Is he only concerned about bulls? No, the bull throughout prophetic literature is an important symbol, among other things, of the great power of empires. The horned ones are ones who bear political rule and authority. And so people read this as saying, not only does this apply to a situation where an animal is dangerous, but also a situation where a man is dangerous. Not just to a situation where a man is dangerous, but also to a situation where a king has lifted up his horn against the people. You have an obligation to pen such a figure in. And that's exactly what they say that the lesser magistrates should be doing with Charles in this situation. They have an obligation to pen him in. They know that he's struck before. They know that he's killed before. He's put towns to the sword. He's forced people to change their religion. The bull has struck before. Now you have an obligation to do something about it, or you will be guilty of his future activities. The law, just as another example of positive obligations to avoid wrongful murder, says that you have to set up cities of refuge, cities of mercy for people. Other obligations that they appeal to, you need to make up a parapet around your roof so that someone won't fall from it and bring bloodshed on your house. You need to take precautions in the case of a malicious witness to eliminate the chance of judicial murder through false testimony by carefully and thoroughly investigating the charges that one brother makes against another. You do all these things because the command not to murder also includes positive obligations to prevent murder. You Benjamites, they say, look at the law of God. You Benjamites, they say, you whose conscience have been touched by believing that in Jesus Christ we don't have to attend to the fears about the world, but we can judge with impartiality, we can follow God's way in confidence of eternal life. You Benjamites, look at the law, look at your own conscience. Don't you know you have an obligation to pen the bull in, to build a parapet around the dangers of this world for us? Don't you see that the death that we're dying right now because of your inaction is a death that God will lay at your feet, just as the blood of the priests of Abiathar and his family fell upon the Benjamites, who, although they didn't obey, nevertheless didn't intervene. So this is, again, their interpretation. The command not to kill is all that we mean. Being faithful, choosing to obey God's law as it's taught to us in Scripture, as it's illustrated in Scripture, regardless of the apparent consequences. That's all we're asking you to do. All we mean by the resistance of the lesser magistrates is following God's law, not man's. You can't deny that if God commands you to do one thing and man commands you to do another, that you have an obligation to do what God commands. We're asking you to consider in conscience, has God commanded you to save people from wrongful, unjust death? Has He commanded you to save people as He's given you the power to do so? They say, we believe that we've pulled away from you. We've illustrated this with the example of Doeg. We have pulled away from you any ground in God's law for not resisting. We ask you to really analyze your conscience and see, are you being faithful to God in following Charles's orders? Or are you being unfaithful to God and, like the Benjamites, following your fears and obeying Saul? Here's the language they speak in. This discourse, this essay we've written, warns Christians that those reasons to desert us, remember they're one city surrounded by the army, everybody else is given up, warns Christians that those reasons to desert us, which they are now inventing for themselves, are not at all satisfying to God. That He should not hold them guilty of our blood and the blood of Christ, for whose sake we are suffering this persecution. Your reasons aren't going to work. We're dying for Christ's sake. We're dying as part of a witness to Christ. and you're saying that you can't disobey God. And we say, in faithfulness, comparing yourself to the Benjamites who allowed Doeg's slaughter of the priests, don't you realize you're just failing in God's command to you to save the lives of innocents? Your excuses are various. Some invent different reasons. Didn't go. Some invent some excuses that they are not able to decide because their superiors are making our rebellion, not religion, an excuse for war. That is to say, some people are saying we have to obey Caesar in this regard because he's punishing you not for your religion, he's punishing you for rebelling. The reason that the armies are gathered around Magdeburg, the reason that we're standing by and not coming to your relief is because Charles is punishing your rebellion, not your religion. And they said, well, since Charles has said that all we have to do to get out of this mess is change our religion and accept the Roman Catholic Church, that's not a real good excuse. Others are saying we lack the strength to throw back Charles. Our resistance would be meaningless, which the Magdeburgians, of course, aren't real sympathetic to, since they're this one town cut off in the middle of an empire, standing alone against the imperial army. But ultimately, they refer the lesser magistrates to their own relation with God. God knows the emptiness of these reasons and whatever other reasons they are able to think up now. And he proves in the consciences of individuals that they are not able to fool God and will pay him the penalties for this abandonment. Ultimately, the argument of the Magdeburgians, after they've gone through the law, they go through the same legal passages that we've talked about today. They said, all this boils down to is don't murder, and don't murder includes doing those things which you can to rescue other people. You have an obligation to do it. You should trust in God that you can fulfill your obligation to do that if you're a lesser magistrate. We've taught you the law. We've pointed you to your own feelings. We've compared your situation to the situation of Doeg and the Benjamites. Now decide before God. Now put yourself in the presence of God and decide in conscience what you can do. Can you really say honestly before God that we are faithfully following and obeying the ruler for the Lord's sake? Are you really in a faithful relationship to God in your relationship to Charles? Or aren't you really just motivated by your fear, by your greed, by your anxiety? And I know this isn't a Tuesday devotion, but they quote from Proverbs 24. They quote at length this proverb, which is, I think, a very beautiful thing for us to consider given our devotion topics otherwise. If you falter in times of trouble, which they admit these are times of trouble, how small is your strength? Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? And will he not repay each person according to what he has done? They put the scriptures in front of them and say, it's not just us asking you to consult your conscience. But the scriptures in this very, very situation, in a time of trouble, when a small group of people are being led away to death, they ask you to put yourself before God, to reflect on the fact that God looks into your heart, and that whatever you can say to us, whatever argumentative cleverness you can come up with reasons not to intervene to us, don't think about our arguments. Think about what God is seeing in your heart actually. And if you don't think that we have the authority to ask you to do this experiment of conscience, here it is in Proverbs 24. Here's our situation. We are being led away to slaughter. Charles is going to come into our city and wipe us all out. We are the people being led to slaughter. Consider how God is looking into your heart and considering the reasons for that. Consider your knowledge of the law of a positive obligation to save people from death. Consider that we're not asking you to resist or do anything fancy. All we're asking you to do is save our lives from destruction. This is religion, they say. This is piety. This is faithfulness. This is the duty of pious men about which God has instructed us in Proverbs 24. He who is the inspector of the heart, he knows. Nothing can deceive the preserver of your soul, and he will render to a man according to his works. So this is, I think, a good place for us to stop and regather our thoughts about what we're doing, first in the law generally, and then with respect to the theory of resistance. Our goal as Christians, our goal in this law school is, of course, to learn what's right and wrong, to study law as a system, to understand its ways and its methods, its practices, its arts, all of those kinds of things. Many people have said a Christian law school shouldn't be any different in any way than a non-Christian law school, because the techniques and the practices that you learn are simply the same. But this school has always said, no, there's at least one great thing that's fundamentally different about a Christian law school, is that when we approach the law, as we approach everything in life, we do it for the Lord's sake. I don't even eat or drink, Paul says, except I do it for the glory of God. I want to live all of my life for the glory of God. Why? Because I, in faith, have come to realize that Christ is the Logos, Christ is the Word, Christ is the structure by which all that has been made was made. It was made for Him and by Him. It holds together in Him. It will all be recapitulated in Him. It's all coming together in Him. I'm ignorant. I'm lost. I'm troubled. I'm in the darkness until I know how to do whatever I do for the Lord's sake. And this is a very frequent source of confusions for Christians as they're maturing. They don't yet know how to do something for the Lord's sake. And that's why we're here. We're here to talk together and learn how to practice law together for the Lord's sake. We're here to do what we do, whether it's briefing a case, whether it's writing a legal research and writing assignment, whether it's memorizing, whether it's arguing, whatever we do, we want to find out how to do it for the glory of God in faithfulness. And it's easy for law compared to other fields because God has shown us. He's told us in places like Romans 13 that the law is not a manufacture of man. It's not a machine that man builds. It's not something artificial. It's His institution. It's His ordinance. The structure of our relation to the rulers is because of His command and what He's established. It's glorious. It's wonderful. You can praise God for the law. You should be thankful for the law. You should be thankful for rulers. This is the source of our basic confidence in obeying rulers. Not some direct perception that we have that everything is going to turn out all right, but God's promise that the rulers and authorities are His institutions. We want the same thing if we're to disobey. If we're going to disobey, we want to disobey also as a part of our respect for what God has ordained and established. That's what the rulers of Magdeburg said. Rulers of Magdeburg said, hey, look, you can resist as a form of obeying God, of trusting in God. Trust in God that He has appointed for us good men to be our rulers, to do good things. And that if the man who currently has power is not doing those things, look around until you find the one He's appointed to resist him. He'll provide him. And if you read the reading today, they give lots of examples of lesser magistrates who have risen up against superior magistrates to do exactly that thing. Jehu is raised up. Read the book of Judges. He gives all these different examples of lesser magistrates who are raised up by God to do just this thing. We want, as a law school, to approach all that we do with faith and confidence in God. We want, as students of history, to look at what's happening in Magdeburg and hear the witness, the heroic witness as it happens, of people who fought, struggled, resisted, but wanted to do so not out of a sense of exultant pride, out of a sense of their right to resist, but who resisted because of a sense of faith in God. What a brave thing to say. All we're doing when we resist is trusting that there's an obligation to save the priests. And here now they're transferring the old priesthood, the priesthood of the Levites, into the universal priesthood of Christ. The priesthood of the church, the universal priesthood of the church. Look at them. Here they are surrounded by Doegs. Doeg wants to kill all of these people. Are we resisting? Well, you can call it resisting. We call it faithfully fulfilling God's command to protect the priests from slaughter. We're not asking you to do anything more complicated, anything more subtle than what everybody who reads the story of Doeg and the Benjamites wish the Benjamites had done. It was good that they refused the order to slaughter the priests. That was good. But it was bad that they stood by and let the slaughter proceed. What do we learn from this? We learn something wonderful. We learn about this great episode in history, inspiring episode in history, when a few people were able in faithfulness to stand before the largest empire, the largest army of the world because of their refusal to change their faith in Jesus Christ. We learn some interesting arguments. We learn these different arguments, a different interpretation of Romans 13, a different interpretation of the command not to kill and its relation to resistance. We learn those things. But the great lesson that I would have you take from this is simply to hear the question of conscience that they put. Are you, in your relation to the law, whether in your obedience or in your disobedience, are you following Christ? If you don't know how to follow Christ at all in your relationship to the law, that's the first thing to solve. Peter puts it really simply. Submit for the Lord's sake. If you have no idea what that means, then keep thinking about it. Keep studying it, because that's the basic way that Peter puts it. Don't submit from fear. Don't submit because you want reward. Submit as a way of following Jesus Christ. Why should you do that? Because it'll transform everything you're doing in the law. Just like it transforms the way you look at the world, if you look at the world as God's creation, as we were singing today in the beautiful song, "This is my Father's world." If you wander through creation thinking this is a random agglomeration of atoms swirling about meaninglessly in a vacuum, you have one view of the world. If you view it as a gift of your Father, a created gift of your Father with purposes and meanings that He's instilled in it as a treasure and given to you, you sing songs about it. We praise God because of the creation of the world. If you view the law as a very clever machine of man, a very clever technique of man for creating social order, you may like it some, you may not like it some. You treat it just like you would treat any machine. It fulfills its purpose, it doesn't fulfill its purpose, there it is. But if you view it the way Paul views it, if you view it the way Peter views it, that interacting with the law, submitting to it, is a way of being faithful to Jesus Christ, well, then you can praise it. You can thank God for it. You can sing songs about it. That's ultimately, of course, the blessing that Luther, the Reformation, wanted for people in their vocations. They wanted it for bakers, they wanted it for tailors, they wanted it for mechanics, they wanted it for all men and all vocations. is a sense and understanding of how, in all that they do, they can do it for the Lord. And of course, we want the same thing for you in the law. You need to figure out, just as the pastors of Magdeburg are begging the lesser magistrates in the case of disobedience, how do you do what you do in the law out of a sense of faithfulness and obedience to God? That in a way is the gospel for us lawyers as lawyers. That there's no part of law that in our personal lives hasn't been redeemed for us insofar as we act in faith and love towards Jesus Christ. Seek after that. Seek after it because the pastors of Magdeburg have, I think, made a very convincing argument that we should evaluate what we're doing in law with a sense of the gravity that we have. Whether or not we are acting faithfully to God in the law, it's a strong matter of conscience that we should consider. But also consider it because it's a blessing and a joy that God wants you to have as His people. It's part of your inheritance. It's part of your sonship. It's part of the world that God has made for you. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for the law. We thank you for the blessings of the law, the way it constrains the unjust, the way it encourages those who are pursuing your ways. Our Father in heaven, as people who have gathered in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, to study law, please show us, Lord. Please guide us through the power of your Holy Spirit, that in all that we do, we can do it trusting in you and following in you, rejoicing in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.